Welcome to the A-Team Group Virtual Data Management Summit Europe. Our next session is a keynote from our Platinum sponsor and is being delivered by Rocky Martinez, Chief Technology Officer, SmartStream RDU. We would like to thank SmartStream RDU for their support, without which this event would not be possible. Rocky's keynote is titled, Data Value Does Not Last Forever. If you have any questions for Rocky, please direct them to the A-Team Group contact on the slide. Over to you, Rocky.
Thank you, Lorna. Thank you for having me today. Thank everybody for watching this. Unfortunate we're doing it virtually, but it's probably in the best interest of everybody involved. Today, I'm going to discuss data value does not last forever. Next for the agenda. So today we're going to discuss defensive, offensive data. How do you determine that value, competitive advantage, how it has doesn't last forever, that it runs its cycle. What do you do once data value is only for defense? How do you use data and your strategy? How do you avoid operational and value pitfalls? And then how do you reduce data stress? So how do you define offensive data? In my experience, offensive data allows you to implement a new strategy. It allows you to create services to retain current customers. It allows you to create activities and services to gain new customers. And it essentially, one of the most important aspects of offensive data is that it allows you to create a barrier entry to competitors so that you can keep your service running with larger margins longer. Now, the definition of defensive data is data which is used by the entire organization and it is common throughout the organization. Data used by multiple operational departments and copied even within that same operational department. Data which does not drive organizational strategy, and data which is easily obtained. So data that you can get tomorrow is defensive data in my point of view, and it doesn't really allow you to create a strategy. So next, we're going to talk about how do you determine what true value of data is. And it was very interesting for me to hear Sarah Walker from NatWest talk about changing her data to competitive value, right? So it is important to understand the value of that data and what competitive edge it gives you, right? So data that gives you competitive edge is what gives you value. So again, it creates something different than your competitors. And a good example is you have data within your organization that allows you to create payment schedules that differ from all the large vendors and have value in your algorithms. That is valuable data. Data that creates an opportunity to keep your service sticky, going back to creating a barrier to entry, is data that is valuable. So if you can use data that's within your organization and predict when an account is going to need funding and nobody else can provide that service, then that data that gives you that algorithm or that service is valuable. And then again, data that you can't get in the market, right? So data that you only have is very valuable. An example I have is you have a sales organization that keeps track of the common known hierarchies within your contacts, but also keeps track of back channels, which not everybody knows of. So the value is great for that data because you have what the back channel communication is, and therefore there's value in that data. So next, what we're going to talk about is data which doesn't add value within an organization. So data, again, which is easily purchased. So if you can buy contact data from any thousands of services out there, that data does not bring a lot of value. Data which you can use for the same purpose is important. Data which you use for the same purpose. So recommendation engine data, which is out there in many, many services. You can buy recommendation data. There's no need for you to create that data within your organization. And data which is available in the market. So stock price movements, which you can buy from different places, is not valuable. So there's no need for you to be wasting all of your resources to do that. So next, we're going to talk about and show how over time, how data loses its competitive advantage. And this is as an organization, going back to what the topic is, as an organization, you need to plan how that data will lose competitive advantage. So if you look in 2016, data that was used for recommendation engines, which is what this graph shows, the cost and the usage of that was small in 2016. And that meant that it was concentrated in a few places. Amazon is probably one of the first users of this type of technology. That was a competitive advantage. But as if you fast forward to 2021, 2022, and 2023, the expense and the amount of money spent in recommendation engines it has a hockey stick growth, which shows you that in 2016, what was a competitive advantage now in 2020 or 2021, 22, 23 becomes more of a service that you need to do to compete. So if you're going to stay in a service or in a market and you don't provide a recommendation engine, you are no longer going to be able to compete, right? So that's the whole point of how we know that data does not keep its competitive advantage and that it moves on. So in 2016, it was not used heavily, and there was a huge competitive advantage. And as you fast forward, it's becoming something you need to do to compete. So next, we're going to talk about what happens if your data is for defense only. So now you're in 2021, 2020, this year, your data is no longer a competitive advantage. It's only for defense, only to compete. You need to look at how does that data now contribute to your new 1 to 5 year plan going out, your strategy. If your strategy does not match your defensive data, then you need to understand what the total cost to keeping that defensive data is. So if defensive data is causing you to slow down because let's say you have 30% of your budget allocated to maintaining that defensive data, you're slowing down your strategy because you're not using every possible resource. So some of the costs that some organizations don't put within their calculations for defensive data is regulation costs. There is cost to keeping data. So GDPR is a great example of this. If you have emails and people's addresses and you have their names and when they work, GDPR data is very costly because now you have to maintain it. You need to audit it. You actually have to store it. And all of that cost adds up. And now it's stealing from the resources you have to execute on your strategy. So next, we're going to talk about how do you use the strategy to decide which data do you use. So let's say for an example, you have your strategy, your organization says, we want to have a data-driven customer experience, which is a common strategy that I'm sure lots of people are looking to do. So what does it cost to capture all of that customer's activity within your ecosystem, right? So you have to understand that your users are going to say, I want every piece of data that you want. Not necessarily the best thing, because there's a few things we're going to talk about now. The first is, do you need all of that data? Some of the data that you're customers or your users are requiring actually have adverse effects. For instance, if you have a trading application, do you need that geolocation data to be stored? What issues around regulation do you have when it comes to keeping that geolocation data? Also, what does it cost to create your data models, your infrastructure, and everything around what it takes to actually start capturing that data? Is there a third party out there that has that already done? Salesforce is a good example. They have a common data model. Why would you as an organization go spend 6 to 12 months trying to normalize a model when you could use a third party service which already has it and you just need to use it? So again, let your strategy decide what actual data you need and how do you want to actually use that data. Because there are other ways to make sure you can execute on your strategy, use the budget properly to execute your strategy, and not spend lots of resources on how to store and maintain that data. So next, we're going to talk about the operational versus value argument or pitfall. So for me, operational data is not valuable. It may be important, but it's not valuable. For the same reasons I've been talking about. Lots of operational data is available in the market. You're getting it from multiple vendors. There are other ways to get that data. It's just that through time and people's habits, operational data has become internalized and it becomes required to run a business. But the value is not in the data itself. So one of the calculations that I like to discuss with clients is how much does it take you to maintain that data versus what it would take you to get from a third party. If you take a true look at that, I'd be surprised if 9 times out of 10 that your operational data is costing you way more than the value that you're actually getting from it. And typical costs of operational data, which are not always discussed, are data quality. There's teams of algorithms, people, all kinds of resources trying to make sure the quality that comes into your organization is met. There's technology cost, hardware and software to maintain that data, data gaps. There's some feeds that for whatever reason don't provide last trade date. And now you have to either write something, create a process, or hire people to fill that last trade date, right? So you got these data gaps. Data access, because of the cost, a lot of data is done through batch. So if your strategy is to create a better service for your customers, and you want it to be online in real time, but yet you have a file somewhere in a batch process, your strategy is being slowed down, right? So that's a cost. You need to know what that cost is. And then regulatory costs. If you have to maintain all of the data and understand the lineage, and you have all these audits, there's cost that's associated with that, right? So there is cost to operational data, and is it as valuable as you think it is outside of being necessary, which is a different argument than it being valuable. So next, we're going to talk about data stress. So how do you reduce your data stress? So you start looking, so as in the previous slide suggested, you look at what your costs are. If your costs are higher to maintain non-valuable data, then you need to say, okay, I have data stress, but what is in that data stress that I need to alleviate with a third party? So you need to make sure that the data that you get from any other organization is cleansed, and you need to make sure that that data matches your current SLAs or even exceeds it. Is the data complete? Are you receiving records with last trade dates? Are they complete and are they accurate? The ability to access the same data through multiple methods. So can you get a batch file? Do you have API access? Can I do both? Can I get something from a batch file and access it through an API? And there's other methods out there that we're starting to deal with, sort of like with Snowflake. Can we load a Snowflake database that someone that can use internally? Ability to alter the data through a service bureau. This is probably something at the bottom of a lot of people's lists, or maybe in the middle, but to me, it's an important service that you have when you use any third party to remove your non-valuable data. You need to be able to contact an organization that allows you to make a change. So I have an example over the last few years. A large data vendor has sent some numeric fields with text, specifically one that it was a numeric field and it was sent with null values inserted here. We have no idea internally what that vendor was doing, but you need a service that can handle that and send a proper value. And for us, our customers called us and said, some wanted a 0 value and some wanted a negative value, so they knew that there was an issue with that field. You need a partner that will actually handle that for you and make sure that your data continues. Next. So to conclude for today's discussion, it is important that you know your strategy. There is nothing more important to execute on any data or functional or anything with an organization. You need to know your strategy and how it's going to affect what you're going to do forward. If you don't know your strategy, then you're dealing, in my opinion, all defensive data because you have no idea and you're just collecting everything. And that's not valuable. You need to know how to identify what offensive data delivers to your strategy. So if your strategy is, again, to data-driven and you need to know the last 10 things a customer purchased, that is valuable data for your organization. Defensive data for a customer-driven strategy would not be knowing what a customer did 5 years ago. You may be able to purchase that information, but what's the point of keeping it or having it? Can you reduce your defensive data costs through an external service, which will free up more resources to execute on your strategy? You have to make sure whatever service you use meets the same SLA or service level agreements that you currently have internally, and look to exceed those through that service. And what resources are returned to the organization when you accelerate the strategy. So if your initial strategy is 1 to 3 years, you reduce your defensive cost, you were able to funnel that money in, and now that strategy can be executed in 1 year as opposed to 3 years. You've got a new competitive edge, and that's going to drive your business faster, better, quicker. So that's the end of my speech. If you have any questions, I pass it off to Lorna to finish up.
Great. Thanks, Rocky, for a very interesting keynote. As Rocky says, if you have any questions, please do direct them to the A-Team group contact on the slide on the screen now. And we recommend that you visit the Sponsor Hub to find out more about how SmartStream RDU can help you solve your data management challenges. Thanks, Rocky.
Thank you. Have a great day.